Wonderful. A very, very warm welcome to everyone who is joining today's Commodity Masterclass on cocoa, hosted by the Mondelēz International team. You're in for a treat today. We're going to have an absolutely fabulous session with a really deep dive into decarbonisation along this commodity supply chain, with lots of great examples and solutions and levers that the Mondelēz team are working on. So I'm Sharon Bly. I lead health and sustainability here at the Consumer Goods Forum. And this is part of the Towards Net Zero Coalition of Action, accelerated learning on really trying to define and amplify and identify the learnings that we have across our member companies on different commodities. This session is being recorded, and the slides that Michael and Cedric will share with you today will also be available on our website after today's session. So during this session, whether you are listening to this afterwards, you won't have the possibility for the live Q&A, but those who are joining us for the live Q&A here in November, please make sure that we respect the antitrust caution statement when we are in the dialogue session at the end of today's event. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined for this jam-packed session with Michael Weber, who's the Senior Director of Climate and Environment, and Cedric van Kutsum, who's the Senior Director of Cocoa Life, who, as I said, are really going to bring you through a really brilliant overview, the context on this commodity, different regional specificities, and I think where you're all really interested in getting the nuggets and the learnings is around the solutions that Mondelēz International have identified. And then for those of you who are here with us live in November, we will have our Q&A session. If you're listening to this in the future, please do not hesitate to reach out with me. I can make that connection with Michael and Cedric going forward for those questions that you may have after listening to the recording. So enjoy the session and do think about all of the questions that you might have for today's excellent speakers. So Michael, I'll hand it over to you to take us through today's session. And yeah, very, very warm welcome, and looking forward to all of the learnings.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sharon. And thanks everyone for taking the time to join today, and also for the ones that are going to listen to the webinar later. We have some informative content lined up, so please capture your questions, as Sharon said, for the Q&A at the very end. So we are thrilled to be here today and talk about Mondelēz's journey in cocoa, which is one of our primary commodities. Similar to the other masterclasses that the CGF held over the past months, we will start with providing an overview of the commodity context and then cover some regional specificities before diving into the solutions part. As Sharon mentioned, I'm delighted that I'm joined by my colleague Cedric today, who is heading the signature program called Cocoa Life, which is heart and center of our sustainable cocoa sourcing strategy and also part of our carbon reduction pathway. With that said, let's go straight to the next slide, please. A little bit of an intro to Mondelēz. We are a global snacks maker, selling snacks in over 150 countries with a net revenue of 36 billion. We hold the #1 place in biscuit globally, #2 in chocolate, and we are growing fast in other categories like cakes, pastries, and snacking bars. We are on a mission to empower people to snack right. We want to offer the right snack at the right moment, produced the right way, and made the right way includes our ingredients, packaging, climate, and social impact agenda, which again includes the topics that we are discussing today, and namely our carbon journey. We have a net zero goal at Mondelēz, and also linking this to the sustainable sourcing agenda that we are having. So both are linking to our session today. Next slide, please. Now let's take a closer look at our Mondelēz carbon footprint. At Mondelēz, we follow the greenhouse gas protocol as the global standard of how to measure, manage, and report greenhouse gases. In 2023, we were looking at around 31 million tons of carbon. When we look at it from a scopes perspective, about 96% are sitting in our scope 3, which is basically outside of our direct control. The remainder, 5% in scopes 1 and 2. Looking at scope 3 particularly, just over 70% are coming from raw materials. That's similar to what other food manufacturers typically see. And if you break it out further, of the 70%, about half comes from cocoa, and the other half comes from dairy, oils, wheat, and other ingredients. So you can see why cocoa is a key element in our carbon reduction journey. On the next page, we take a closer look at what the key carbon sources are and how we define our strategies at Mondelēz. So carbon sources, there are three carbon sources that we are focusing on typically. The first one is the land conversion aspect, driven by agricultural production. That's basically the conversion of natural ecosystems that store carbon, such as forests, into agricultural land in order to meet demand. The second one is farming practices, such as monocultures and tilling practices that can release carbon from soil, or other farming inputs like fertilizers that are linked to carbon. And thirdly, the fossil fuel usage, such as oil and natural gas for electricity, heat production, and making plastics for packaging. The first two are particularly important. Land conversion and farm practices are particularly important for our commodities, including cocoa. The respective strategies therefore include our deforestation-free position, which forms a cornerstone of our net zero pathway. Focus lies here on cocoa, but also palm, soy, and fiber-based packaging. And secondly, our agenda on regenerative agriculture, which includes farming practices also on cocoa farms next to wheat and dairy. So this is rounding off the picture across Mondelēz, explaining very briefly of why we are focusing on this topic particularly. The next slide, please. We are now going into the cocoa sector as a whole. So we're stepping away from Mondelēz. Let's take a step-up look on the sector. It all starts with cocoa beans that are then processed. The major components of cocoa are cocoa butter, cocoa powder, cocoa liquor. The market size for those components was worth around 26 billion in 2023. And of course, these components flow into chocolate and other cocoa-containing products, which means the true market value that cocoa influences is significantly higher. The cocoa tree was first domesticated about 5,300 years ago and only came in equatorial South America, I should say, and only came to Africa in the 19th century. I'm saying this because it spread from there. Today, cocoa beans are primarily grown around at about 20 degrees to the north and south of the equator in more than 50 countries. In the harvest 2022 and 23, we saw around 5 million tons of production produced worldwide. About half of that came from the top two producing countries, Ivory Coast and Ghana. And you see other top producers, Ecuador, Cameroon, and the others, covering around I think just over 85% of the total production globally. About 10 years ago, the volume was closer to 4 million tons and has been grown steadily ever since. The recent harvests are showing a downward trend, though, as the yields have been impacted by climate change, amongst other reasons, which is responsible also for the increase in prices we see today. I'm mentioning this because the yield impact is an important element as we are looking at the carbon picture going forward. Next slide, please. This slide shows the major movements and export streams of cocoa. And the disclaimer here is it's not exhaustive. There are many more smaller streams. We try to keep this on the larger streams only. As such, we see that the export happens towards all major chocolate processing and chocolate consuming markets. You see the streams from West Africa, being Ghana, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, and Cameroon, mainly towards Europe, with the largest receiving countries being the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany. Netherlands is also the largest re-exporter in Europe. West Africa is also exporting to the US, Canada, and Indonesia. Other countries that are exporting are Ecuador. And what we also found, and worthwhile mentioning here, is that some other countries like Brazil are mainly producing for their domestic market. So you might not see the movements from key producers around the globe. Next slide, please. Now that we know where cocoa is grown, we'll start to take a closer look at the carbon sources and the carbon sinks, more particularly for cocoa. There are three major carbon sources that we can mention today. The first one is land use change. According to the IPCC, land use change contributes around up to 20% of total greenhouse gas emissions, making it a major factor in climate change. Next to soy, palm, beef, and timber, cocoa contributes to that number. So again, that drives the whole importance of looking at it. The impact of deforestation is also the reason why the Science-Based Target Initiative requires the shift to deforestation-free sourcing as part of the net zero goal validation. So for cocoa, in fact, the largest carbon driver is land use change, and more specifically deforestation. As mentioned earlier, that's the conversion of natural ecosystems. During that process of deforestation, the carbon bound in biomass is released over time by burning and degrading wood. Other carbon sources are coming from farming inputs like nitrogen-based fertilizers, which are broken down by microbes in soil to other greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide, which is about 300 times more powerful than carbon. Another source worthwhile mentioning here is a third group of carbon sources that links to methane set free by decomposing waste. Can be leaves, can be other organic matter. Methane is has about 80 times the warming potential compared to carbon. In addition to focusing on how to reduce those greenhouse gas sources, it's equally important to also look at creating carbon sinks. That's the blue area here. A carbon sink can bind and store carbon in biomass, as for example is the case when planting trees as part of agroforestry measures. So the question now is, how is each of those components contributing overall in average to the carbon picture in cocoa? And that leads us to the next slide, please. So from a carbon accounting perspective, we use emission factors as means to evaluate and compare emission intensities. That's basically the carbon emitted per kilogram or per ton of cocoa sourced. This already translates all of the different greenhouse gases that I mentioned on the previous slide into carbon equivalent. So you always only see the CO2 equivalent number here. When looking at the emission factors for cocoa, we see a wide range between countries and growing areas, as historically deforestation events and land management practices can vary a lot. Also, there's also a significant lack of data in many areas. The emission factor databases are typically looking at global or country averages. So the picture here shows the global average for cocoa. It basically suggests 15 kilogram of carbon equivalents are released for every kilogram of cocoa beans grown. The land use change component is the single largest driver. It can be, depending on the area and region, can be contributing up to 95% of the total carbon emissions. The remainder would be land management practices and finally energy and other farming inputs. Most companies therefore focus on the first two, on the land use change and on the land management practices to be able to tackle carbon reduction. In the next chapter, we would like to look a little bit deeper into the regional and country specificities. Here you're finding again the sourcing regions that the sourcing countries that we mentioned earlier. You also find the production volumes for comparison again, the 10-year trend, which I will get to in a second, and then the emission factors for the different countries. The land use change impact within the emission factor, as mentioned earlier, is high, is high across the board. It can be different though. So What can be taken away from the slide to start with is that some countries, emission factors like Ivory Coast and Indonesia are in the range of 20 to 30, while other countries range more in the 10 to 20 range, and Ghana being the lowest. A few observations. Typically, the less deforestation events there were, or the further back in time they happen, obviously the lower the land use change contribution. The production volume trend plays a key role here because when you see countries expand their volumes significantly year over year, the risk or the pressure on forests also can increase. On the other hand, when you see countries that are reducing or have a lower output over time, you can also see an increase in emission factor because now the land use change component is attributed to less volume produced. So there are many dynamics that can play into high and low emission factors. And just to sum this up, obviously, fast expansion plays into pressure on forests. But also reduction in output volume can mean that the past events of deforestation have to be picked up by less volume. There are certainly other complexities and dynamics in countries, such as diversifying commodities. Countries are growing different commodities in the same space, and then we are talking land use change, allocation complexities, and so on. Now that we have covered the carbon essentials, I would like to hand over to my colleague Cedric, who will take us through the main archetypes in the cocoa production and the ins and outs of the Cocoa Life program, bringing my theory to life. Over to you, Cedric.
Yes, I'll try that. Thanks, Michael. So let me start with a few words to explain how cocoa is actually produced. So most of the cocoa in the world comes from smallholders, or what we can also call family farming. So only 5% comes from more intensive large-scale farming or plantations, similar to what we see in other crops. And that's what you can see on that picture on the right side. So again, that's only 5%. So it means the remaining 95% of the production comes from farming families, which we believe represents about 5 to 6 million farming households. These households usually operate a piece of land that ranges from 1 to 5 hectares, which is still relatively small. That's between less than 1.5 to 7 football pitches, just to give you a bit of an idea. They usually have quite low yields, at least below proven potential. They have average yields of 400 to 600 kilos per hectare. The growth we saw over the last years really came from expansion of land and not really through intensification of existing farmland. And this can drive to land clearing. Usually farmers, or at least in some countries, farmers are members of farmers organizations that we also call cooperatives. And these organizations will really support farmers with the commercialization of their products. And usually majority of these households' income will really come mainly from cocoa farming. By the way, on the left side, you can see a cocoa bead. And so these are found inside cocoa pods, which is the fruit that grows on cocoa tree. Long time ago, it was used by the Mayas as a currency, as a fun fact that you can use one day maybe. Next slide, please. So now that you know nearly everything about cocoa farming, let's take a closer look at the challenges we're facing. We can say that all these challenges you can see on the page are important to cocoa production to some degree. So it was quite hard to pick the ones with the highest impact. From a carbon perspective, we wanted to highlight a few, and which are the ones we'll really try to dive into today. So we had really 4 challenges we wanted to talk about. First, we do need to deal with large and fragmented farms. So as I said earlier, cocoa is produced by about 5 million smallholder farmers from different countries, as Michael showed you. Not all these farmers are registered. They don't have an ID card and so on, which means we don't really know who they are. We don't always know where they produce the cocoa and under what condition they produce the cocoa. Another important challenge we see is the speed and rate of adoption. Again, we don't operate plantations that we could control, but we rework and try to influence farming households to adopt some practices, while they usually don't, or at least they don't always own the land they farm. So land tenure is complicated. They often need to focus on short-term priority needs instead of remaking the long-term investment that would be required on their farms. And they sometimes lack the knowledge in basic education. So that's the second area of challenge we see. The third one is really the lack of accurate carbon data. And so, yeah, as I said, lands are usually not registered. We do not really have detailed farm level data or even historical data of the farming activities. And considering the large number of producers we need to deal with, monitoring and the data collection of what's happening at a farm level is quite challenging. Another challenge is the lack of regulatory and policy landscapes. In some countries, we actually miss up-to-date maps of protected areas, which are critical to be able to monitor really what's happening. We also sometimes have a lack of clarity on what are the carbon claims policies and who can really own and claim these carbon reduction from the different interventions. And in some countries, we need to deal, and we're facing what is considered illegal mining, which is also poorly regulated and can also be a challenge towards cocoa production. And then last and not least, as obviously any other crop, but still worth mentioning, there is a strong dependency on nature. Cocoa farmers need to deal with the fast-changing climate patterns, and these can vary country per country, but we talk about longer period of drought, or also rainfalls that are much more intense than they used to be in the past. Next slide, please. And next again. And so, yeah, I think as you heard, there have been quite some challenges we need to deal with. Now, we do see some solutions to these. And today we really wanted to take you through 3 case studies we have to illustrate our decarbonization journey. I'll start by talking of our Cocoa Life program, which is our program to reach a large number of farmers and really be able to facilitate lasting interventions at farm level, but also in the communities. And this, we really see this as the foundation then for additional work and for the other 2 case studies. The second case study will really explore how we address deforestation in cocoa regions. As Michael mentioned, deforestation is the largest contributor for carbon emissions. So obviously key to address this. And then for the third case study, we will look at how we support farmers to implement good practices, good farming practices, which includes the promotion of agroforestry, because this contributes both to carbon reduction, but also to carbon removals. So next slide, and let's start with Cocoa Life then. So over 10 years ago, actually 12 years ago, we launched Cocoa Life, which is Mondelēz program for more sustainable cocoa. Back then, when we introduced the program, we really pioneered with quite a different model, as we decided to focus on a holistic community-based approach, while we were seeing the rest of the industry in the sector usually focusing on what is considered supply chain certification. We decided to take a more holistic view. With the program, we aim at investing $1 billion over the period starting from 2012 until 2030. You can find a lot of progress report, and I have a slide at the end, but by end of 23, we were working across 9 different cocoa producing countries. We had registered over 225,000 farmers. We were working with about 50 implementing partners. We think that is really important because we need to involve all actors of the sector to really be able to catalyze collaboration and have the impact over the long term. And then last, all the efforts and all the investment is actually being managed by a dedicated team, which is part of Mondelēz, and most of our colleagues are based in the producing countries. The thinking behind the program was we cannot focus at farm level only. We also need to look at the environment where the farmer and their families operate and live. So it was critical to understand what the farmers, but also other stakeholders such as the communities, what they want, and more importantly, what they need. It's only once we gain that understanding that we can really roll out interventions which include decarbonization and make these more sustainable over time. And on the picture, you can see how cocoa grows. I was mentioning earlier the cocoa pod, which is the fruit that grows on tree. So that's what you can see on that left picture. Next slide, please. So now that we've been implementing the program for over 10 years, this really confirmed the relevance of this integrated approach we've been taking. And we believe it's even more important once it comes to carbon emission reduction and removals. So that's why we really decided and will continue to work at 3 different levels. First, we work with the households that are producing the ingredients, so in this case, the cocoa, to improve their level of livelihoods. This usually takes different shapes and forms, but we usually focus at supporting farmers with training and technical knowledge so they can have more profitable farming management. And we also support the households to diversify their sources of income so they don't rely on one crop only. Our second area of work is really working with the entire community where the farmers live. And so we support these by setting the right foundations so they're really empowered to drive their own development. So thanks to the support we bring them, the communities are really able to decide what are the priorities they want to focus on. And again, this can then take different interventions such as improving access to water or also adoption of clean cook stoves, which is something that has proven to have some carbon reduction also. So for us, we think it's critical to really acknowledge and respect that every community is different and comes with different needs, and there is a way to empower them to define these needs and to work towards these. And then lastly, our third focus area is to work on the environment that surrounds the farming households. And so we support these households to further protect and restore the forest, but also to avoid further land conversion, which is a key driver for emissions, as Michael mentioned earlier. So this holistic approach really allows us to work in an inclusive way towards these systemic solutions, which we believe have to be embedded in the communities themselves. So we see this as a first critical step as we need to deal with these large and fragmented supplier landscapes. Next, please. And so that now takes me to the second case study we wanted to talk to you about. So as you heard, land use change and land conversion is a key driver for carbon emissions in cocoa. It also contributes and accelerates change in climate patterns that are then affecting cocoa farming because it can have an impact on the yields we can see on these cocoa farms. So that's why we've been investing in different interventions to address these issues. And different examples are first building the awareness of farmers and the community members. And we usually do this through sensitization events at the community level. We've also been spending a lot of time at supporting tree planting on and off farms. We are sometimes called that as agroforestry, and I'll talk more about it after. We have been mapping cocoa farms because once you have the shape and the borders of the farms that are registered in the program, you can then have an overlap with satellite images and to monitor there's no deforestation on and around the cocoa farms. And then lastly, we've been supporting farmers with different sorts of incentives to really promote the adoption of these good practices. So over the years, we noticed that these interventions allowed us to improve the accuracy of the carbon data at farm level, but also to improve the adoption of good practices on and off farms by the farmers and by the community members. And they also allowed us to support farmers in mitigating the impact of climate change on their farms, which we saw clearly accelerating over the last decade. So on the slide, you can see more progress figures of our program in West Africa, where we see near to no deforestation on and around the cocoa life registered farms. And we had similar interventions that were rolled out in other countries also, which includes Indonesia, Brazil, and others. The pictures there on the right side are a model, quite an interesting model we implemented in Ghana called a modified Tunja system, where we really work again in an inclusive way with the members of the community to restore degraded land. So they usually start by planting some banana trees and then start to have some cocoa trees underneath the banana trees and grow other species of trees. And so after a few years, they end up with an agroforestry parcels that produce cocoa, but not only, it also has income from other economic trees. And so we believe all these interventions are scalable, but as usual, they require a few enablers. The first one is robust monitoring, reporting, and verification system that needs to be provided by multiple providers and not be locked with one provider only. And the second is the need to have strong public-private partnerships, because obviously a company like Mondelēz cannot do this alone, but the industry cannot do this alone. So it needs to fit within a national strategy, which is critical. And so if you go to the next slide, please, a good example for this is an initiative called the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. And we as Mondelēz were really proud to be a founding member of this initiative, together with the governments of Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, and 34 leading companies. And the idea was really to come together with the ambition to end deforestation in these two countries and to restore the forest areas. So this allowed a few things. It really allowed us to together agree on some critical interventions that should be implemented. But it also allowed us to align what were the success indicators and how to measure the progress over time. So we're sure we're all comparing apples to apples and not talking about different metrics and different ways to measure these. And then the different partners, both on the government side and on the industry side, committed to report progress annually, meaning we can hold each other accountable. With this, as I was saying earlier, we were also able to make sure that the efforts of the industry were really feeding into a national strategy, and it should not be the other way around. So now we've been into this for over, I think, 5 years now. There's still much more efforts needed. I think that the gap we still have is really to be able to together accelerate more collective actions. But we see this partnership as a key foundation for the sector to be successful over the long term. On the short term, one opportunity for this initiative is also to see how together we can leverage the power of such public-private partnership to comply with all the upcoming regulations. And then if you move to the next slide, please. This is our last case study for today before we turn to Q&A. And it's about developing land management practices. What we did notice over time is farm practices and improving the farm practices is another promising measure to address carbon emissions, while on the other hand, it also allows us to improve the household's livelihoods. So there's a clear win-win in such case. So the targeted interventions we had there, again, just to mention a few, was to implement measures to increase yield, mainly through training of farmers. And so by end of 23, we had reported training over to 120,000 farmers. We have also been introducing in countries where it was possible, because in some cases they're all banned, on improved planting material. So we've been introducing and distributing improved planting material, which are basically improved cocoa trees. And by end of 23, we had distributed over 30 million of these cocoa seedlings. And the last thing we've been redoing at scale, training the farmers and building more knowledge was good, but it was not sufficient because every farm and every farmer is different. So it was important to start rolling out farm development plans that were more specific to each farm and to the ambition of each farmer. So far, these interventions showed very promising results at different levels. One is making cocoa farming more profitable, but two is also continue to build knowledge on farming techniques. And last is making cocoa farming more resilient to climate change. And once more, this was really possible thanks to different enablers. First, we wanted to highlight the need to have very strong implementing partners to deliver these interventions at scale on the ground. This takes quite some skills. They really need to be familiar with the local context, but also respected and trusted by local stakeholders, which we noticed can take quite some time to build. And so usually our implementing partners, we work with a mix of our cocoa suppliers that can help, especially with farmer training, but also with local and international NGOs that usually helps us more with the community work. Another enabler was to have a reliable independent verification and learning partners. And for this, we decided to work with two different partners, FlowCert and Ipsos, who are one providing us with a certain verification of our chain of custody, but two, also really measuring the impact we have or that we might not have, so we can learn from this and then course correct the program over time. Another enabler, and again, it's a bit stating the obvious, but strong collaboration with governments in these producing countries is a must. You need a strong alignment between the public and the private sector to be successful. And then last, having different multi-stakeholder platforms really allowed us to challenge the status quo sometimes and to be able to share learnings and good practices across the sector. So if you go to the next slide, please. So one of this farm management practice is what we're calling agroforestry. In very simple terms, agroforestry, or the way we've been defining it and implementing it, is about planting on-farm economic shade trees. So this really comes with two strong benefits, and there's more, as you can see on the slide. But on one hand, it can support improving the farmer's income, while on the other hand, it can allow to maintain the moisture and the humidity in the soil, which is critical so farmers can continue to have a good production over time. And in parallel, of course, it helps sequester carbon. So we see this as a very good case in identifying and scaling such win-win solutions, both for the industry and for the producer at the start of the supply chain. If you go to the next slide, please. So that's why we decided to collaborate with one of our key suppliers, so Barry Callebaut, in a research institution called CABI, in a long-term trial looking at different ways to do agroforestry in Côte d'Ivoire. And with this, we were able to evaluate really the economic and environmental performance of these different agroforestry systems. We were able then to capture the learnings from this trial into a protocol that is now being in use when we're training farmers. One challenge we continue to have once it comes to agroforestry and in general about tree planting is the ability to monitor and ensure the survival of the trees in an effective way. It's easy to do it when you distribute 1,000 trees, but once you distribute 1 million trees, ensuring survival and monitoring this is quite challenging. And we do hope that technologies will help us to do so in the future. So next slide, please, to try to bring it all together and bring it to a conclusion. Thanks to these 3 case studies and the over 10 years of implementing Cocoa Life now, we do really believe that through an integrated approach, which involves both farmers and their communities, but that feeds also into a national strategy that needs to be supported by the right public-private partnership, we can together work on 4 critical levers, which are first, ending deforestation, 2, promoting on-farm agroforestry systems, 3, supporting higher productivity to produce more cocoa from less land and where cocoa farming can be more profitable, and last, improving the cocoa farming management. And we believe by implementing this, we will really be able to address some major carbon drivers and support the decarbonization of the sector. And as part of the journey, companies will be able to translate these actions into customized emission factors that could then replace generic emission factors in our supply chain and would really help us reach the improvement we need to see in our Scope 3 footprint. if you want to know more about Cocoa Life, and next slide, please. This is an infographic we have on our website. We can follow up with the link after, where you can find much more progress data and the different interventions we're implementing. That's it for now, and I think we're turning over to Q&A then.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cedric and Michael, for that really informative webinar and bringing it all together on that one slide that I'm sure will be really informative for listeners. So if you are listening to this in the future and you do have questions after listening to the presentation, please reach out to me on hs@theconsumergoodsforum.com, the health and sustainability team at theconsumergoodsforum.com, and we will make the bridge and the connection on your questions.